Welcome to Cybersecurity Shall Be C-Level Priority, the podcast that puts the digital world to the test. Cyber attacks are on the rise, and data is the most valuable asset in today's world. But how can we protect what matters most to us? Drawing on the latest insights, effective strategies, and practical tools, we'll show you how to create a more secure digital environment. Because one thing is clear, security isn't negotiable, it's a top priority.
I mentioned it at the beginning already in our pre-conversation. I often hear, this topic is open source a driver of innovation or a ticking time bomb?
That's a very good question. I would say it's a bit of both. This is, of course, now a very unsatisfactory answer. I guess, yes, I think so. That open source definitely is a very relevant topic, is that it drives innovations forward. But you also have to think very carefully, especially in the corporate context, in the business context. Where do you use open source and how do you use it? And also to have control over it and to know where you bring in which areas. Of course, open source brings enormous opportunities for a company. Really also quickly certain things not always needing to be reinvented. Having to reinvent, but also to rely on patterns and on solutions that have been around for a while to also take advantage of. I believe that, especially in the context of cybersecurity, we have many points where it is extremely relevant. I'll put it this way, authentication libraries, crypto libraries. Personally, I wouldn't trust any crypto algorithm that is developed behind closed doors and not made public. Simply because a company or an organization that develops something like that, not or never, is able to secure it like that and have so many perspectives on it, like a whole community that works there.
I think here we also need to backtrack a bit, especially when it comes to the topic of open source. Open source isn't always open. Source, how many people imagine this in traditional ways? This is now a product or a tool, an application that is now open source. But we already talked about it in the preliminary discussion. Microsoft Teams uses open source components because there are indeed open source libraries that are integrated into all programs in some way, whether it's paid software or free software. There are so many open source libraries that are part of our daily software that we use every day. And I think many people forget that when we talk about open source, people always think it's something like Open Office or something else. Tools that are based on open source, but it also includes open source libraries that are also present in our traditional software.
I think I would go so far as to say that I can hardly imagine that there are companies that none use of open source companies have exactly, as you said, whether it's libraries, complete tools, or even programming languages in part. Those are, of course, all things that every component, every open source component should also have a corresponding license. That's another point, where many companies, but also individuals, partly, as they say, fail, but I sometimes get a bit sidetracked. Just because the product is open source, that doesn't always mean that I want to use it just like that. I think that's it. That's also such an important point that developers, both male and female, as well as managers, need to keep in mind. What kind of license models are there? Are they copyleft licenses where it can't just be used freely like that, how one would like, but the licenses also come with requirements that, for example, private products can also be made open source or published again. On the other hand, there are, of course, very permissive licenses that strongly support the use as well. And often it is also missing from developers. Developers just lack this sensitivity to develop it.
Yes, I would also bring up the topic here. The usability might be the wrong word, but also the visibility needs to be taken into account. I just had a client again, for example, regarding DORA, he now has to deal with topics like exit strategy and so on. And the company, especially the IT department, wasn't even aware of it. How much open source is there in-house? You just mentioned it. I would like to put forward the thesis to put it out there. 90% of all applications contain some open source component. That's what I've heard. Now, no solid numbers that they can somehow say this is now verifiable. But that's also my gut feeling in my work, where I keep noticing that the problem is that software sometimes handles these topics very opaquely. So what's open source about that and what isn't open source? And now we come to your favorite topic, namely, it's also about that through various standards and different requirements. It's also important to be aware and think about it. What does my software include? And that brings us to the nice topic, the software bill of materials. That's right. Right now, this topic is being demanded from many areas, or rather many regulations are now requiring it, where you also have to think about it. So what does the software include? What do you think about the topic? Do you think that a software bill of materials can mitigate this ticking time bomb of open source, so to speak, so that you know more about it? So what is open source now? And you can also think about it, of course. How do I incorporate this into my security concept? Or is the topic software for you? Education, material? First of all, the first step to achieve any kind of visibility at all.
My opinion on S-BOMs is very mixed. As you already know, it is, I think S-BOMs are fundamentally very good. It's the first step in the right direction regarding visibility, transparency, not just about open source components. But really also, what does my software depend on? Because I believe that nowadays software products and projects are growing, more and more lines of code are coming together. It always happens, teams. People might change their jobs. They have built something, and everything is growing in that direction. And the maintenance of that becomes very, very difficult. I believe that a well-made S-BOM is a good S-BOM. It can really be very, very, very helpful in covering those topics. What I often see mixed up with S-BOMs, and often a bit confused, also in various places in the industry, is my S-BOM. Will it help me avoid my vulnerabilities? Or in this case, it will be used again. The log4shell. The log4shell vulnerability in the log4j library, if I have an S-BOM, will it no longer be seen as critically, or will a similar case not be so critical anymore? And this mixture between vulnerabilities and S-BOMs is, in my view, very critical, because an S-BOM is primarily a static listing of the components. And here it comes again, it gets very complicated very quickly. What is a component? What does it include? But even now, for example, let's assume I have some Docker container with some Alpine Linux as the base image. This is mine. Deployable artifact. Of course, I need to put that somewhere. And the S-BOM is the S-BOM node of the software. Does the S-BOM also include my Alpine, for example? The Alpine itself as a line item in the S-BOM, or I also have to list all the subcomponents of my Alpine. That's obviously a very difficult thing because, as you can see, an S-BOM can quickly expand in scope, go up and completely explode. So that this supposed idea of transparency just leads to a lot of confusion. Now, for example, let's assume the topic of log facial. Let's take a quick step back in time. And we have the log4j vulnerability, and we have all the S-BOMs. That means now I find out in my S-BOM, okay, I have a vulnerable component of log4j. Can I fix it directly now? Can I even do that? That's the next question again. Because maybe it's not a direct dependency that I install myself. in the version management, or maybe it's a subdependency of a subdependency, subdependency of a subdependency. So 10 steps down in the dependency tree. And I have an extremely large number of dependencies from others, suppliers and providers. And that's the point where it can get really interesting again. And it gets interesting. What is a dependency? Which ones do I need to list? It's always mentioned that you first need to list the direct dependencies. But for example, the FDA, it didn't include that limitation. That means it can quickly get out of hand. I don't know. What do you think? With increasing complexity, with growing documentation, we don't burden our developers, maybe a bit too much.
Yes, I also believe that the problem is, and I completely agree with you, is it really the Holy Grail also to talk about the topic of security? I see the S-BOM topic more as a kind of asset inventory on the other hand, which is also important, especially from a compliance perspective. For example, regarding licenses and so on, I agree with you. From a security perspective, I think it will be more difficult because at the end of the day, I feel somewhat powerless. It's nice to know that my software might include some component which is no longer current, for example. But what can I do now? The manufacturer of this application has to do something. That means I might not be able to write to the manufacturer and say, hey, dear manufacturer, you have this component here that might not be completely up to date. Would you maybe update your software so that I'm safer there?
And then there's that. Then the manufacturer says, oh yes, but that's a different manufacturer of mine. Who does that? And that's another manufacturer. And then it goes down the chain completely. Down. And then it's the subcompany of the subcompany of the subcompany of the suppliers who has something built in, who maybe doesn't have a secure development lifecycle, who doesn't have an S-BOM, who doesn't know. And I think then it's also like a hot potato that's being passed around a bit until we reach a good point. But just to be clear, I believe that an S-BOM is a very, very important point, and that it has to be a really good start and is, however, it also makes sense to be made possible for the developers creating S-BOMs manually. It's a nightmare, and I wouldn't want to put that on anyone. The next point is also very important: automation. How can you make something like that seamless for teams? What's that called in German? Teams? Seamless. Seamlessly integrated into the development process so that it really isn't an additional mental load for the developer, but that it is generated automatically. But on the other hand, the topic of awareness comes into play again. Developers need to be trained in analyzing what kind of third-party components they are using. What kind of libraries do I want to embed? Because it all starts there. Of course, you should give developers a lot of freedom to do their work creatively and well. However, I think you also have to pay a bit of attention to that and look out for it, that trustworthy packages are used. I don't know if you noticed that or saw it. Last year at the Global AppSec in Lisbon, there was a very interesting talk about AI hallucination where someone asked about library recommendations, and due to AI hallucination, something was recommended, which actually didn't exist at all, which then led to, or what could potentially, it could also lead to that attackers can then grab these recommended libraries, like grabbing and packing in malware. That means we also have this component that you really have to check the trustworthiness of open source components. Because of course you find a lot of very good things, but also sometimes a few things that could potentially be critical.
What I also find to be a topic there, especially when we talk about mobility, there have also been cases like, for example, XC utils, where it also happened that there was an application where malware was deliberately introduced by someone, which was then also released. As a company, I can't really protect myself against that. So that's also quite a story. There was also a great documentary by Simplicissimus. Can I also gladly include that in the description again for anyone who is interested in that? Again, they recorded it very well, how that all went down. And it only came out by chance, so to speak, that something happened there. As a company, I can't really protect myself against that because I have the time to really look at the entire source code at home, or I just use this application. And for me, this topic of false security comes up again. So a software bill of materials is also a kind of that for many companies. False security. Okay, I have something here with which I have now, so to speak, security is checked off because I now know which components are included, but I can't really assess the components themselves. And I want to make it very clear here again, because there was a huge outcry about it. Oh, open source, we can't use it anymore because we don't really know what happens. I don't see it that way at all. Open source is a super important part for me. We've already talked about that. 90% of all applications have open source in them, and you are not allowed to do that either. Labeling it as a ticking time bomb, but of course you have to optimize your security concept for open source and really take that path to think about it. What can I do about it? And not just close my eyes and say, yes, open source is like a black box for me and I can't do anything about it.
Absolutely. I believe there's even more that can be done. To be honest, once this topic we will sow, I think it's very unrealistic to get by without open source. Or from my perspective, it's completely impossible. And there is a really great picture from XKCD. I don't know if you're familiar with it. What exactly was used in the case of XEutils? You can practically see it like this. A giant image made up of blocks with extreme complexity. And then it's all hanging down from a tiny little box that's all alone in some corner. What it should represent is just that when a lot of products, a lot of other libraries somehow have a dependency that is maintained and managed by a person somewhere in the middle of nowhere. There, I think, is the crux of the matter. I believe open source needs more support. So many companies use open source, so many companies take advantage of it. I think as a company, you should also ask yourself, can I give something back? And I don't mean giving back in the sense of my own code or my own application, open source positions. No, not at all. But can I give my developers who might be very knowledgeable about these technologies, who do a lot there, giving the opportunity to give back to the open source community? Because the open source community thrives not on, I'll put it bluntly, unemployed people who don't know what they should or can do throughout the day, but it lives from people who, in addition to their jobs, get involved and contribute there. And I believe if we could have a little give back there as well, from so many developers who might use it daily, that would certainly be a huge gain.
You're bringing up an important topic right now, because that's also something I wanted to talk to you about, namely this topic. Developers and security departments. Developers by definition have this, motivation to release things quickly and above all to incorporate improvements quickly as well, while the security department is often seen as a challenge for many developers. Do I not want to evaluate that myself? But that's what I keep noticing. Sure, seen as a burden. Because they want to have tests first, they want to have audits, they want to have scans and so on and so forth. Which is true, but I believe here, and you just mentioned this, it's again about communication, an important tool, because one side needs it and the other does too. Development, especially when it comes to products, needs to bring a certain speed and also a certain, let's say, flexibility. But you also need the security side, so to speak, to ensure the development. And a developer in general, I've noticed that quite often he has his own way, his method of how he develops and also his way of developing. And that doesn't mean that security is the complete opposite of that. But you really have to talk to each other and look at things together. And you also have to say that it's not just about the topic. How do we together create this path? And what I've also noticed, and you can feel free to add something to that, that a developer in principle has nothing against it. It's just that sometimes it's done to him like that this security is just kind of slapped on top and that there isn't a collaborative approach to it. What can we do?
I would like to go back to the first sentence you said. You have that developers might be under a lot of pressure and want to release features quickly. I have a slightly different opinion. I am of the opinion that developers should first, they want to build cool software. The pressure comes from another side. The pressure comes from product management, from a product ownership team, from a market where maybe this thought is mistakenly held. Oh, now we're agile. Agile, the buzzword of the year. That was in 2020. That's a few years ago. But agile means that we are faster. But that's also a bit of a misinterpretation and isn't necessarily true. You also have to see that in the current times, developers are increasingly having to balance more and more things. Things they have to balance. You start from, okay, I have to work through my stories, develop my code. But now there aren't separate DevOps or separate tests anymore. Instead, the developer also tests. That means he also has to bring a lot of experience to the table. In the area of automation, then we deploy it over a Kubernetes. So we have containerized it in Docker containers in a distributed environment that is managed via Kubernetes. In some cloud, maybe even in multi-cloud setups. That means the developer has more and more on their plate. On his desk, cloud, authentication libraries, testing, code development. The frameworks are also constantly evolving. That means when a new version of Angular comes out, then he has to get back into it there as well, because there might be breaking changes from the previous version, and the code has to be refactored, things need to be adjusted, and so on and so forth. The complexity is increasing. And now security comes into play, and now we're doing DevSecOps. And now suddenly security is the top priority for everything, which is also very unfair. That's why, in my view, a successful secure by design DevSecOps, whatever you want to call it, and secure product development is based on 2 points: communication and automation. Communication to raise awareness, but not just from the security side to the developers. So we need to move away from this concept that we security people are so superior. In our context, we are the healers, the ones who bring things down, and down are, and only we know what. So only we are almighty and knowing. But communication goes in 2 directions. In other words, we need to understand, what does the developer do? How does he work? How does she work? How does their software development lifecycle work? And we cannot demand that for us everything is changed because of us, but we need to see how we can embed ourselves there as well, because it's completely unrealistic and leads to a lot of frustration and clashes between the teams. When you say, yes, we've eaten wisdom with spoons, and now we're coming here to show you how it's done. And then developers rightly say no, then I find my alternative way to do it.
You're speaking from my heart, because it's not just like that with developers. It's the same with IT departments. They always have 1,000 things that they have to take on, so to speak. And then security comes on top. There are many who say, okay, security, and this is, so to speak, the holy grail, and that's how it has to be done. And I also say very clearly, no, that's just not how it is. We can learn from each other, and in the end, we all have the same goal. We want to protect the company from harm. We want to grow with the company ourselves. We want the company to do well ourselves. Everyone has their own way of doing things, as you already said. But in the end, we have the same goal, and communication is a super important way to achieve that. Even for me as a CISO or someone responsible for security, it's important to question myself from time to time. Why are they doing it that way? I don't need to learn programming to understand the developer, but I can sit down with the developer and ask them, why did you do it that way? or why do we need this library now, which I might evaluate differently from a security perspective. And that's always a recurring topic. Communication is always the be-all and end-all in the world, and especially when we talk about such complex topics where you can't always be the all-in-one solution for every topic.
Absolutely. And I think this topic is also about evaluating libraries. A very simple example. There's a library that is maintained by two people. It's maintained for some very specific case that the developer wants. What do we do with that? We in security would really like to avoid that. Because, for example, it's not being maintained for much longer, or the maintenance is very sparse for this library. We don't know where it comes from. The license is a bit, potentially, also critical, depending on how you use it. And the developer says, yes, but there's nothing else. Sorry, there's nothing else. And then comes the point where you have to do a risk assessment. Does the company want to take on this risk? That's not a decision that a developer makes. But that's also not a decision the security falls. That's a decision that lies with the business. It has to ultimately, and that's important again, that we in security don't want to go along with this fear-mongering. Oh my God, we have to secure everything now, because otherwise we'll be hacked tomorrow. No. I think what you said earlier, we have a common goal to protect a company, but we can also protect companies by simply, now comes an unpleasant comparison to today's times. By building a wall around it and not allowing any communication outside and no internet access, then the company is safe. Then we should all be happy. But we won't do that. Because the goal of a company is to, in the manufacturing sector, to develop products that you then sell and market. And that means we all actually need to have the goal of developing good products to make products with high quality. And I think that's why security also needs to be reintegrated there. Security is a quality feature. Security is not the goal. It's a means to an end to develop high quality products.
Yes, I completely agree with you 100%. And above all, what I always see from practice myself, this balance between usability and security, if you don't adhere to them, as you already said, then the developer will just find another way. Then he says in German, I beep about security. And I'll just find another way so that I can also maintain my usability for myself, so to speak. And for me, that's the danger. And just this example where you said, okay, cut off from the internet with walls all around it. There's a nice saying from the former CIA chief who said that the only secure system would have to be wrapped in reinforced concrete, be cut off from the internet. It would be hidden somewhere. And even then, he wouldn't be sure if it wouldn't be hackable. And that just shows that even if you were to do something like that, there will always be ways for people who really want to. And here, I believe it's always super important to maintain that balance between usability and security. And as you already said, not just from a marketing perspective, security is now my driver to sell something. That's why I have to build my products around security. No, security is also the possibility, especially in digitalization, that your products actually work, that they are also possible, so that you can operate your products securely. But one thing doesn't always come without the other.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think there are so many facets coming together here. The topic, secure products, secure development, communication, but also technical expertise are all like topics that are totally intertwined. And also in the current times with the becoming increasingly complex scenarios are, of course, super relevant. And I believe open source helps us in many areas, and it helps not to reinvent the wheel all the time, not always doing new things or wasting time. Things to do it in-house. I had a little while ago 2001 team in a different context, so not in my professional context, but in another context. They tried to write some libraries for encryption of their data because they were in some very specific scenario with partly outdated software components that they couldn't patch themselves. And of course, they got creative again and their own, I'm just putting it that way, want to write crypto libraries. That was, of course, a very, very interesting conversation with the developer. So, okay. No, very bad idea. So that's not what we do. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. And how do we do it then? And how do we improve it?
Right now, because we've been focusing on the topic of development, we have addressed. It's also an interesting question for me, maybe coming from your practical experience. Do you see this shift left security approach as the current method that one should develop by?
Yes, and no. That's another typical consultant question. I was in consulting for a long time, and whenever such a question comes up, it depends. I'm getting away from that.
I was just about to say the consultant says it exactly. That sentence is what I would also bring up as a consultant.
Absolutely. Depends. Let's see. Shift left. Absolutely. Shift left basically means nothing. So if we put our development lifecycle of a product onto a spectrum, then we have the very beginning, the definition of requirements, the design phase, the development phase, testing, deployment, and operation, so to speak. And what often happens, even in the past, is that it was developed, everything fits, and then at some point just before release, someone comes around the corner and says, so, hey, stop, security. You need to do a pen test. And then you do a pen test and you might find a lot of things. And then it has to be accepted or not. Whether you go live with these findings, do you have to provide a risk assessment? And that can, of course, delay the go live. If I now say, okay, instead of testing just before the release, I'm going to try this shift left thing. I try to start as early as possible, maybe already in the design phase with threat modeling, for example. I'm already trying static code analysis to very obvious mistakes or very easily fixable errors, already identifying it directly with the developer in the console, so in the IDE. And this leads to my software having a certain standard of, yes, a trivial example, hard-coded passwords or SQL injections, no matter which. You can then ensure that these very, very serious issues might not be present. And so you can, I don't want to say make a pen test obsolete, because that would be very wrong. But the penetration tester can really focus on the logical flaws, those things where a person is needed to test, focus on those and not on the really easy ones. Automatically discoverable issues. On the other hand, if I now say, so I'm saying now, okay, we're only going to do shift left. From now on, we're starting right at the beginning. But that's also a transformation for every company. And this shift left topic also takes some time. And it would be very almost reckless to say, okay, we're only going to do shift left now and transform ourselves and leave everything behind until you don't shift left. Properly stated, do I need controls that help me ensure my products are still safe? Or do I need a security point that still helps me? Then it helps to bring the products to market safely.
I think that's an important point too. You shouldn't rest on that. I often see that too. You put it on your banner, you want to do shift left, but the path to get there is not something that happens today or tomorrow. It's always a journey. It takes time, it takes a while. It's also a path that doesn't just go straight through, but there are also a lot of waste, detours you take or a roundabout you get into and have to start over. And you shouldn't go in with your eyes closed and say, okay, now we're doing it, now we're safe, or now we're better. As you said, you always have to have a plan B in hand. So to speak, okay, what can we do right now before we actually start with shift left?
What do you think about the topic of shift left? So do you see that it's being used a lot, or what's your experience with it?
I'll be honest with you, I think shift left has become a bit of a buzzword in our industry. So everyone likes to write that down. We do shift left and we are safe because we do shift left. But it's the same with we are certified to 27001. What does that mean for me? For me, that first says that you've understood in the market that shift left has become a great buzzword.
Or under zero trust.
Yeah, you don't really know that either. Because zero trust is actually what I say. That's the running gag that you can use everywhere. But yes, it's nice that you know it. But just like with the certification, you have to look under the hood. What does shift left mean to you? And we just talked about that. So how do you implement this process? Or how do you approach this path? For me, that means you have to take a look at it and then be able to say, okay, is it good or is it bad? And personally, I have to say, yes, I think it's good. Because even if this is now a buzzword that many use, you talk about it, you discuss it, you exchange ideas. And that's already a good thing in itself. And I have to say, in comparison to zero trust, shift left is already much more clearly defined. So when we're already talking about shift left, I would say 80% the same. And it's not like with zero trust where every company has its own opinion about it, what zero trust ultimately is. So from that perspective, yes, I would say I see it as a positive trend, and I also see it that many companies do it. But I have to say very clearly, many companies also start with it and unfortunately forget that the journey is a bit longer. Just like with a certification.
And I think the path to, sorry for interrupting you, the path to the topic of security by design and shift left and everything that comes with it has certain prerequisites. I don't need to start with shift left in a team. And on such topics or DevSecOps, if the team doesn't have a certain level of DevOps maturity, if I don't have automated pipelines, if I don't have any automation, but also there are still companies where a lot is still done manually. If I start there, if I start with security by design, shift left, DevSecOps, then I just stand there and say, yeah, okay, where are my pipelines where I can integrate myself? And if they don't exist, then they need to be built first. So the maturity to really address the topic of shift left requires some requirements that already exist.
I completely agree with you. And that's not just the case with shift left, but also with many other topics where many say, hey, I want to get a certification now, or I don't want to follow this standard. And then they forget to have the foundation of the house first. They want to build the roof right away, but the foundation is missing and the floors are missing too. And I see the danger in that. That's why I say for me, that's the best word. I don't mean that negatively at all, but simply because, as I say again, my favorite word, there's this false sense of security. It's just like with a certificate. How often do I see that I need to be certified in 27001 now so that I can get contracts, so that I can participate in tenders, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, it's still the case that I want to say that has changed a bit now. So to highlight that positively, it's not like it used to be, where people would really say, I certify my broom closet just to have a certificate. Instead, many companies now see the benefits of having a certificate. But there are still companies out there that have a certificate because they need it, and then they say, hey, I have a certificate now and I'm secure. A great example was when I went to a company with which we did a project, and the first response was, we are certified in 27001. With us, you don't have to do anything. And I thought, okay, that's, as a consultant, you could give the classic answer again, IT depends. But my response was then, okay, then we are exactly the right consultants for you. Let me show you. You haven't understood it yet. But yes, I think right now when it comes to the topic of chef left, you can see a lot of buzz around it in the market. And I think what's great about chef left is that it really involves the developers. That's not quite the story. That now it's said, this is now. Security is driven 100% by security. But it's really also about, as you said, the development process, about how the developers handle it. And also a thing or two, empowering the developers and saying, look, we need these processes, we need the automation to get started. And these are things that developers have been demanding for years. So it's nothing new.
Absolutely. And I would go even a step further, even a shift left, so even further. I believe the beginning shouldn't be with the developers anymore. It should be with the business, in the business area, with the decision makers, the ones who design the products. If they don't think so, like a trivial example, we're building a website in which financial data. Well, let's leave the financial data aside. Health data, no, that's a bit Car data. No, that was also, well, damn. I was just about to say car data is also tricky. Health data too, financial data too with DORA. Well, any personal data. And then it says, okay, we're doing a login. And then the business specifies that it's the login. Yes, because we want to make the left simple. So it must have at least 4 characters. At most 8, maybe just numbers. Because that way people can easily remember it. And it increases the usability of our product. And then we say, okay, and as you can rather use your email as a username, and if you enter your password incorrectly 3 or 4 times, it's really not that bad. Maybe you just mistyped there. So let's allow that you can enter it, I don't know, an infinite number of times. Whatever, that's where it all starts. Then the developer can write such perfect code that has no SQL injection vulnerabilities and no hard-coded passwords and none. Cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, service-side request forgery, and so on. Everything is totally secure. But if the product is designed to be insecure from the start, then it can still be attacked very quickly. And that's where it starts to involve the business. What are those practices? It's 4 digits as a password. That's my PIN. That has to be clear. Could it be a decision? Because you want to make it easy for the users, but then other components need to be added. For example, a second factor. Sure, you can have a 4-digit PIN, but then the second factor always has to be added behind it. And then you can do something like that. But without these second assurance parts, this layer model. So not only one security control, but several that are for different, are dependent on situations or help and support. It's really the important part. And that's where awareness, training, and education really start much earlier.
Yes. And what I always say about this, especially this vague usability, security, what I've already mentioned, is to develop that sensitivity. That's super important to me too. That you also just listen to the people, those that are related to the topic. And as we've already said, communication is the most important thing. To look at these, let's say, seemingly issues that might not come up for some people from the other side, so to speak. And that's always super important to me. Many people often say, especially from a consultant's perspective, my solution is the best solution and only this solution is possible. I've been saying for years, and that's also the point of this podcast, there isn't just one solution to reach the goal. There are so many solutions that lead to the goal, and you can also discuss it and listen to other opinions. And you don't always have to insist on your own opinion.
Absolutely. And I think it's often that's a bit of security vendor bashing. It's not meant personally towards you, but technical solutions are not the cure-all. It's not the silver bullet. They help, they support, they can have an extremely big impact, but just buy tools left and right. And those who do not use them sensibly doesn't really help much. I once had a client, and that was very interesting. It's been a while. He said something like, yeah, we have everything. On paper, static code analysis, dynamic code analysis, software composition analysis. They had the container scanners, everything in the cloud infrastructure. It was all fully automated with all kinds of tools and very early on in the tool chain and so on. However, they still had a lot of findings during every pen test, and they just couldn't explain it. Okay. Talk to the developers, and then it turns out that the developers didn't have access to the security tools at all. That means they had a static code analysis that ran through. It had findings. They were also in the pipeline, so there were also, okay, look, findings here, so there are this many, and these are them. Go there, click on it, and then the developers didn't have accounts in these security tools. Dynamic code analysis is exactly the same. They had everything. They had also spent a lot of money on it, but they just hadn't integrated it properly, and the developers didn't have access to it. Then they said, why should I make more work for myself? On paper, 100%. The coolest paper, the worst I've ever seen. Process. So, technology, 100%. Process and people, 0. That was really exciting.
That's exactly the point I've been saying over and over. This topic of technology is driven very strongly by the industry because, of course, there are cybersecurity technology providers like sand on the beach, but this communication between technology, processes, and people in the context of the company is what creates security. I totally agree with you, but I don't just see this in development, but in many other areas as well. I always give the classic example. In the past, especially when we talked about IT security, we always talked about a firewall. You went to a company and they said, yeah, I have a firewall. That was the standard statement. I'm secure because I have a firewall. These days, it's like, yeah, I have a firewall. I have IDS. I have IPS. I have segmentation. I might even have a SIEM system. Then the question always comes up, yeah, but who takes care of that? How do the systems then interact with each other? Then it can sometimes get really, really, really exciting. But yes, I believe that we are indeed constantly driven by the market. Companies are also driven by the market because, let's be honest, from a practical perspective, you are now a customer who has little contact with the topic, or maybe someone who is just starting out. I don't want to say new, because if someone is just now getting into cybersecurity, then I don't know what he has been doing in recent years. But let's say I've realigned myself and need to engage more with the topic. Then I start looking for it. And then I find exactly these technology providers that offer me all sorts of technologies. Now it's always nice too, with the batch AI on it, because that's the thing. After Zero Trust, AI is now the next buzzword that's being slapped on everything. But when you question whether that's really AI, then it's usually the case anyway. These are systems that have been in use for years, namely machine learning systems or systems that have a baseline and then detect an anomaly. So everything that has actually been standard technology for years is now just being sold better with the batch AI label because it sounds nicer. And then I get a tool and then I don't really think about this tool. No thoughts around it. So I don't have a process. What do I do with the tool? Instead, I might best use it as my service solution and then tell myself, from my perspective, out of sight, out of mind, I now have a tool, and then I just leave it at that. And I believe that's the case. A topic that we will be struggling with for years to come because the lobby behind it is just huge. And the other point is, I always say this again, if I'm someone who has no idea about it and then falls for a marketing promise like that, how am I supposed to tell if it's right or wrong? I really have no idea right now. How am I supposed to recognize that it's the same with consultants? How am I supposed to recognize if it's good or bad when I have no idea about the topic myself?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, on the other hand, yes, you mentioned a big lobby, a lot of people, a lot going on there. Absolutely. But I think there's always this desire to maybe find the easy way out. Buying a tool is primarily much easier than retraining my entire team. To retrain and streamline, to think differently, to work differently, to act differently. That's always the point about transformations. Just because I use Jira doesn't mean I am agile. Just because I use some security tools doesn't mean I'm secure. It's really always this surrounding context that we, as the security community, need to be careful about. How do we get that across? And I think we need to make it easier to convey. Security can be extremely complex. And I think it's also sometimes a bit cool, but we're really in this bubble, in this really cool bubble, where we do extremely exciting and great things. And from the outside, we seem like a side field where it's like, oh, it must be really cool and really exciting over there. We are the nerds. We are the nerds. Yes, many think of it like this. Yes, they do penetration tests for a day and hack systems. And so this image, yes, all maturity or whatever, war games and similar things. But I think we need to clear this fog and really help the left. We are not a mysterious, similar thing, but we need to work together and we need to help them to understand it and definitely get more people on our side. So no gatekeeping, but open up more, carry it outwards more, and really try more to present things simply for people. And maybe, and this is of course a very critical topic that you bring up, maybe also the compliance club burn, that we don't always fall back on this compliance club and say, do you want to do a Kane CPU at design? Do you want to shift left? Wait, where's my club? Here's the compliance club. And if you don't do this now, then you won't be able to sell any products anymore. Haha.
I find that really exciting because it was just perfect advertising for the podcast, because that's exactly the goal of the podcast, to say, we want to break out of this bubble and explain it in an understandable way, because that's also the case. Ask someone in your environment what your job is. So for me, for example, when I say I do cybersecurity, the perception ranges from I'm the pen tester and I hack something to that's some kind of weird guy. A guy who somehow sits in the basement at his mom's place and is just sitting at the computer like something out of the Matrix. Is everything included? I always find the best example at a parent-teacher day at school, where my daughter explained, I'm the firefighter of the internet. That was basically her explanation of what I do, but yeah, I'm totally with you. It's really a societal issue. And we need to achieve this mindset change, but we won't achieve this mindset change by staying in our bubble and always talking everything up and somehow expert throwing around terms. And here comes blockchain, and here comes zero trust, and here comes Shiflesif. And it feels like Arbape is somehow like that, the one who most best words used. It also somehow has the greatest reputation, and that's exactly what I want to break down with this podcast. I want to make it understandable for everyone, whether they have knowledge of the subject or not. Having knowledge of the subject, providing a way to understand it, and I agree with you, we need to interact more with people. We can't just say, hey, they have to stay dumb here, because they don't understand it anyway. We need to take them along. And this topic of the compliance club, you're touching on a hard issue for me. With this fear-based approach, we need to stop. What do we see in terms of cybersecurity? We always see when the next one has been hacked. We see when the next one has been attacked. We see, oh, that idiot, he didn't take care of it again. We see that the next community has been hacked. But what does that create in us? Man, we're afraid of that. We always think, well, I can't do anything about it anyway. I'm always the next one to get hacked. Then I always put on my blinders and just do nothing at all. But that's exactly the wrong approach. And that's why I've been saying for years with this motto, cybersecurity is a top priority. Not that the boss should handle cybersecurity himself, but that the boss positions himself as a kind of coach, standing together with his team and saying, come on, we have this football game. Cybersecurity is ahead of us. And there's a striker, there's a goalkeeper, there is a midfield, there are all positions, and everyone has their reason for being here, and we all have to do this together. And everyone is equally valuable and equally important in this team. Because everyone has a different role, a different task. The other one has to prevent it, so to speak. The hacker, meaning the ball, comes into my own goal. The striker has to maintain the wall, so to speak, or rather themselves. Also looking for the gap to score a goal against the other. Also, it's also about thinking things through a bit. What am I doing there? The defense must always be there, that no hacker gets through. So, I always like to use this analogy between football and cybersecurity, because I believe the most well-known sport in Germany is simply football. Even if I can out myself. I can already say that I'm not a huge fan of football or any team, so you can all bash me. What, you're not a football fan?
No, I'm not. We're in the same boat today, we won't bash.
That's right. Absolutely. But I believe that it also shows how important this topic is. And especially when you mention compliance, I always have to say we also have the issue that we have so many compliance topics currently on the table. Whether this is now, for example, for companies in the FSI, the DORA is, then the 2, then maybe there are still 27, looking 1 on the way, and this and that and the other. And for me, the topic of compliance is good as well. To first get let's say, a red thread and maybe also a bit of guidance on the sides of the highway. A guardrail where you can also slide against it sometimes. And okay, I'm not going to veer off the road now. But compliance can't just be that way. The possibility or compliance is also not the way for me to say, you're not doing cybersecurity now, and now you have to do cybersecurity, or now you have to do this. Because then I see this effect again, which I see again and again quite often. I'm doing cybersecurity now because I have to do cybersecurity, but I don't see the value behind it. From other systems, instead, I just get my check mark, it's nice, I'm compliant, and everything is fine. On the other hand, I shouldn't overregulate myself with compliance by saying, okay, I have compliance now. And now I have to do this. Do this, do that, and back and forth. Because then I always think, yes, The world also exists without cybersecurity, and there are other compliance topics that are just as important. And that's where I often see it happening. As you already said, the club, I think it's a good analogy. Then the compliance club is always pulled out and says, you must do this now. But then mistakes happen, or things happen that it's not implemented the way it should be, how it should actually be implemented. And that's a topic I've been advocating for years. Stop with this fear-mongering, with this, oh, if you don't do anything now, then you'll be the next victim. Oh, if you don't do anything now, you'll lose so and so many millions.
And I believe the topic of victim blaming, so I would say the question isn't whether you'll get hacked. The question is when there are so many complex scenarios for products, for companies that are being bombarded by everything in this digital connected world. And I really believe that the question isn't if, but when it will happen. I think we as an industry also need to stop with the bashing. Oh, he just got hacked. And oh, this outrage, this being outraged. And that also leads to the fact that maybe people are less likely to make it public. If they don't necessarily have to, it can happen to anyone. If someone has a car accident, you also go there and say, you have 2001.
You hit my car.
You did. Sure, it might be a very bad example, but it can also make it into the press. But this fundamental outrage over the attack, we should also stop that. I believe that if we all look deeply into each other's eyes, then we all know how many threats are bombarding companies, and that it's very difficult always to be on the side that successfully fended off the attack.
I think there's also an important topic here. You just brought it up as an example. In the end, to say, hey, it's your fault, or you're to blame, or you made the mistake. You made the mistake. That doesn't get us anywhere. And more, I think, and I keep saying this ability to criticize, especially in Germany in the current times, you can't say anything anymore, or if you do say something, it's immediately perceived as criticism, or as nonsense perceived. Even in the cybersecurity field, you can also just admit your mistakes and say, hey, listen up, folks. I made this mistake. It always happens like that. We have always not had our measures right. And then I think you shouldn't just jump in and say, it's you're the one to blame for my data being compromised or whatever. Yes, we're all human. We make mistakes. That's just how it is. And that's really important to me to draw these lessons learned. I also know that it's a buzzword, lessons learned. He always says, yes, you have to learn from the lessons. But for me, it's always important to just say, okay, to admit to yourself, we made the mistake. What can we improve now? So that next time we might not be affected by it. Unfortunately, it's like this. I don't know how you see it, but I often notice a company has been attacked. Then there's quickly a sense of relief, incident response, and so on and so forth. 2 weeks later, you might be back to normal operations. But then they've already forgotten that something happened there. And 3 weeks later, you've been hacked again. So this success, or I would say the frequency with which companies get attacked again after an incident, or I would say they fail on exactly the same topic. I see that quite often because people tend to act quickly out of that situation, which is also correct. Of course, you want to go back to get back to normal operations, but then not taking the time to look at the lessons learned. What did I do wrong now, or what can we improve? And then in the end, the same attacker or another attacker exploits exactly the same vulnerability again.
I think what we should do, I don't know, do you know the concept or the format of fuck-up nights?
Yes, know it.
This has also been very helpful in agile contexts or in agile transformations, where a long time ago, where I was, it really helped a lot to start addressing this topic of failure culture, where also people in the company, not now, at the employee level, but also at higher management levels, to really talk openly about sack absurd, what have you. Where has something ever gone right? Where did things go really wrong? Where did you maybe also make some wrong decisions? Because none of us is infallible. Infallible. Does that word even exist? It doesn't matter. Sorry. None of us makes no mistakes and never makes mistakes, but really, how do we deal with it? Do we want to cover it up and sweep it under the carpet? Or do we pull a lesson learned out? Oh, what a bingo thing. And do it differently or better next time. And I believe that applies to many areas and can be nicely integrated everywhere.
I have one last question for you, because I think we could keep talking for another 4 hours. And I always find that great. We actually completely changed the topic. But I think for everyone who's listening now and has stayed with us until now, you understood why we did it this way? Because these are simply topics that matter to us, that are close to our hearts. Now, looking back at open source and maybe also considering the topic of compliance, even if we don't want to bring out the big stick, but generally talk about the topic, how do you see the current development regarding compliance and open source? There are now various requirements, also now in relation, for example, focusing more on topics like DORA or NIST 2. We've already talked about a topic, namely our favorite topic, software bill of materials, which is also a requirement that comes out of the standards. Where do you see the future in that? Do you think there needs to be more regulation for open source? Or do you think we would be better off rather think more about the foundation of a house, especially in relation to the topic of open source, and not always trying to build the roof of the house first through compliance?
You already said to start with the foundation. And the foundation really means awareness, transparency. What do we use? What do we not use? You need to prioritize certain things. But one should also consider, what kind of open source strategy do you want to pursue? What does one want? What do you do? How do you protect yourself, for example, against supply chain attacks? We saw it. I don't know. Was it NPM? Or TIP? Which package manager? I believe it was from Python, where there is also an effort to regularly introduce shared code and shared software. Is there also this balance again between, I patch very quickly with the latest available version, but I first take a quick look at what's in it. So how quickly do I need to patch to maybe address some critical nonsense about it? To fix it. But how fast or how slow do I want to be to really ensure that what's in there? That's a topic that many companies need to take care of. And you shouldn't lose sight of the topic of licenses either. And to think a little bit about it that comes with the licenses. I would just say, and this is of course very, very difficult, because now the password is there, the S-BOMs and this and that, and the vulnerability exchange, and we all don't want Log4j anymore. Or, yes, to put it bluntly, in the Cybersecurity Resilience Act, there are also new topics regarding S-BOM. I believe that S-BOMs are also mandatory with every product that is delivered. It's a part of it that you really start with the basics, ensuring that the fundamental concepts are well understood and not just try way too high goals to set, so that you really can't meet it at all and you actually end up drowning in this chaos. Perhaps I don't know if that answers your question.
Absolutely. And I definitely thank you for the open exchange with you. And as I said, I think we could have talked for another 4 hours. I find it really exciting what you just mentioned at the beginning. You have to know where we need to go, where we need to collaborate. And that's exactly what I want to achieve with the podcast. Guys, let's talk about it. Let's find a solution together. Because only together can we all break out of this bubble. And also for the others who might want to know or talk about it, to provide the opportunity to talk about it. I thank you for being here, and I would say that's it for this time from today's episode. Cybersecurity is a top priority. See you next time. Thank you, Nico. I had fun.